For decades, Germany's war masters mocked America as a nation of soft shopkeepers, rich, comfortable, and hopeless in real war. But by 1944, those same generals faced a terrifying truth. They weren't fighting an army. They were fighting a machine. And once it started moving, nothing on earth could stop it. The German High Command had spent years studying the United States. They read American newspapers, analyzed military reports, and observed its society from afar. And the conclusion they reached seemed obvious to them. America was rich, comfortable, soft. To the hardened officers, raised in the brutal traditions of Prussian warfare, the United States looked less like a military power and more like a nation of businessmen and shopkeepers. A country obsessed with profit, individual freedom, and modern comforts, hardly the ingredients of a serious fighting force. From Berlin's perspective in 1941, the evidence supported their belief. The U.S. Army was small, numbering barely 6 million men. Its tanks were thin-skinned and outdated. Many of its officers had not seen real combat since the trenches of World War I more than 20 years earlier. In military terms, that was an eternity. Meanwhile, Germany stood at the height of its power. Poland had collapsed in weeks. France, one of Europe's greatest armies, had fallen in just 6. The Wehrmacht's lightning warfare had stunned the world, and by late 1941, German troops were already at the gates of Moscow. Then came December 7th. When news of Pearl Harbor reached Berlin, German planners calmly added America to the strategic map. Their calculations were simple. The United States would need years to mobilize, train, equip, and ship an army across the Atlantic. By then, they believed the war in Europe would already be decided. It seemed like flawless logic. But hidden behind factory walls, shipyards, and assembly lines across America, something was already beginning to move. And soon the Germans would realize they had not just underestimated an army. They had underestimated an entire industrial civilization preparing for war. But the first cracks in Germany's confidence didn't come from the battlefield. They came from spreadsheets. Inside quiet intelligence offices in Berlin, German analysts began reviewing reports from agents in the United States, shipping records, factory outputs, economic data. At first, the numbers looked wrong, completely impossible, so they checked again and again. The reports claimed American shipyards, many of which had been nearly dormant just a few years earlier, were now producing cargo ships at a speed that defied every known rule of industrial production. These weren't traditional shipbuilding projects that took 6 months or more. Americans were assembling ships like giant mechanical kits, welding together massive, prefabricated sections. Then came the number that stunned them. One Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, had been built from the first keel plate to launch in just 4 days and 15 hours. To German naval planners, this sounded like propaganda. It had to be. After all, the German U-boat fleet was sinking Allied shipping faster than Britain could replace it. Submarine warfare was supposed to choke the Atlantic supply lines and starve Britain into surrender. But when the analysts ran the calculations again, a chilling reality emerged. America wasn't just replacing lost ships. It was building them faster than Germany could sink them. And the reports from American factories were even more unbelievable. At Ford's massive Willow Run plant in Michigan, a factory stretching nearly a mile long, heavy bombers rolled off assembly lines the way Model T cars once had. German intelligence reports claimed the United States was producing more B-24 bombers in a single month than Germany could build in an entire year. To the German high command, it sounded like fantasy. Germany had the most organized wartime economy in Europe. Their industry had been mobilized since 1939. Yet somehow, the Americans, while fighting a war across 2 oceans and supplying Britain and the Soviet Union, were outproducing the Third Reich by 3, 4, even 5 times in key categories. And then came the tanks. Germany's panzer divisions were masterpieces of engineering, powerful, complex machines built with the precision of fine instruments. America took a different approach. Instead of building perfect tanks, they built thousands of good ones. The M4 Sherman rolled off assembly lines like automobiles. 10,000, 20,000. By the end of the war, over 50,000 tanks. At that moment, German planners began to feel something they hadn't felt in years. Not fear, but something close. Because America wasn't just building an army, it was building an avalanche of steel. Even as those impossible production numbers piled up, the German high command held on to one comforting belief. Material wasn't everything. You could hand a shopkeeper the finest rifle in the world, they argued, but that didn't make him a soldier. You could give him a tank, but that didn't make him a tanker. The real test would come on the battlefield. And in early 1943, for a brief moment, it looked like the Germans had been right all along. The first major clash between American and German ground forces in the European theater erupted in the harsh mountains of Tunisia at a narrow corridor called Kasserine Pass. There, fresh American troops, green and inexperienced and poorly coordinated, ran straight into the battle-hardened veterans of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's legendary Africa Corps. The result was brutal. American units broke under pressure. Command structures faltered. Tanks and trucks were abandoned across the desert floor as German forces pushed forward with ruthless efficiency. To German soldiers walking among the wreckage of brand new American equipment, the battle confirmed everything they had believed. This was the enemy they expected: clumsy, poorly trained, lacking discipline. Compared to the frozen nightmare of the Eastern Front, where German troops had faced relentless Soviet assaults at places like Stalingrad, the Americans seemed almost cautious, too careful, too hesitant. One captured German report described them bluntly. The Americans, it said, lacked fanatical determination. They were not like the Russians, who would charge machine guns and accept staggering losses. The Americans seemed unwilling to sacrifice men that way. To the German officer corps, that looked like weakness. So the high command settled into a new comfortable assumption. Yes, America had an absurd amount of equipment: tanks, planes, trucks, artillery. But it didn't matter, because in the end, they believed the professional German soldier, with his superior training discipline and tactical skill, would always defeat a mass army of amateurs. Quality, they were certain, would always beat quantity. For a while, the war in Italy seemed to confirm that belief. But slowly, almost quietly, something began to change. The Americans were learning. And when they learned fast. By 1944, the German high command still believed they understood their enemy. Yes, the Americans had more equipment. Yes, their factories were producing weapons at unbelievable speeds. But German generals remained confident in one final assumption. When it came to real combat skill, courage, and battlefield experience would still decide the war. That belief survived, right up until the morning of June 6, 1944, D-Day. At first, the sheer scale of the invasion was staggering. More than 5,000 ships flooded the English Channel, an armada so massive it seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. No military in history had ever attempted an operation of that size. But even that wasn't what truly shocked German commanders. Factories could explain ships. What they couldn't explain was the American way of fighting. In the tangled hedgerow country of Normandy, German veterans began noticing something strange. When an American infantry platoon encountered a well-hidden German machine gun nest, they didn't react the way European soldiers had for centuries. They didn't rush it. They didn't attempt a risky flanking maneuver. Instead, the young American lieutenant, often barely 22 years old, picked up his radio. First came the company mortars. If the machine gun kept firing, he called in battalion heavy mortars, still firing. Then came divisional artillery. Within minutes, 12 105mm howitzers could unleash a storm of steel, more shells in 10 minutes than a German unit might fire in an entire week. And if the problem still wasn't solved, the lieutenant simply called the sky. Soon, P-47 Thunderbolts would appear overhead, screaming down with rockets and 500-pound bombs. If the target was close enough to the coast, even battleships offshore might join in firing shells the size of small cars. Only after the hedgerow had been completely erased from the landscape, reduced to burning wood and craters, would the American infantry advance. To German officers watching this unfold, it was baffling, wasteful, almost cowardly. But there was one undeniable truth they could no longer ignore. It worked. The Americans were advancing slowly, but relentlessly. And for the first time, German commanders began to realize something terrifying. They weren't fighting soldiers the old way anymore. They were fighting an industrial system designed for war. What the Germans were witnessing in Normandy wasn't just a new tactic. It was a completely different philosophy of war. For generations, German military doctrine had been built around precision and efficiency. Every artillery shell mattered. Every gallon of fuel had to be calculated. Logistics was a delicate equation: deliver just enough supplies to win the battle, but never waste precious resources. Waste in the German system was a sin. The Americans, however, seemed to follow an entirely different set of rules. Their system wasn't built on scarcity. It was built on abundance. When German intelligence officers captured American supply depots in France, many of them thought they were seeing things. Reports sent back to Berlin described mountains of ammunition crates, endless rows of fuel barrels, fields filled with spare parts, tires, engines, uniforms, chocolate, and cigarettes. Entire acres of supplies, sometimes sitting out in the open rain. To German quartermasters, this was madness. But that madness had a devastating advantage. American units never had to stop. They could fire 10,000 artillery shells at a stubborn crossroads and not worry about running out tomorrow. If a tank broke down, it was often easier to replace the entire engine than repair it in the field. If a battalion took losses, fresh replacements were already moving forward from an endless pipeline stretching back across the Atlantic. It meant American divisions could fight at full intensity, day after day, week after week. German divisions couldn't. After a major battle, a German unit was often exhausted, short on ammunition, low on fuel, and missing irreplaceable men and equipment. Recovery could take weeks. The Americans needed days. And there was another difference that terrified German commanders even more: mobility. Despite the terrifying image of blitzkrieg, the vast majority of the German army still moved the same way armies had for centuries: on foot. And behind them, hundreds of thousands of horses pulling artillery and supply wagons. The American army had no horses, not one. Every unit from headquarters to frontline infantry was fully motorized. Thousands of trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, armored vehicles. If a German division needed to move 100 miles to reinforce a collapsing front, they marched for 3 or 4 exhausting days. When an American commander received the same order, he simply told his men, "Get in the trucks." 6 hours later, they arrived fresh, fully supplied, and ready to fight. At that moment, the German High Command began to understand the terrifying truth. They were no longer fighting another army. They were fighting an engine that never stopped moving. By the summer of 1944, the German army in Normandy was still holding the line, but barely. Weeks of brutal fighting in the hedgerows had slowed the Allied advance to a crawl. German defenses were stubborn, disciplined, and expertly organized. To many commanders, it still looked like a fair fight. But the Americans weren't preparing for another battle. They were preparing to break the war open. In late July 1944, the Allies launched Operation Cobra, a carefully planned strike designed to smash a hole through the German front. And they did it the American way. First came the bombers. Thousands of heavy and medium bombers filled the skies above a narrow section of the German line. Then, in one of the most concentrated airstrikes of the war, they unleashed a carpet bombing so massive, it literally erased entire defensive positions from the map. The elite German Panzer Division, one of the best armored formations in the Wehrmacht, was caught directly beneath the bombardment. What remained afterward was devastation. Survivors stumbled through the wreckage in shock, some found miles away, days later, unable to speak, unable to remember what had happened. And then the ground began to move. Through the shattered German defenses poured American armored divisions, led by one of the most aggressive commanders of the war, General George S. Patton. But Patton's forces didn't advance the way European armies traditionally fought. They didn't stop to carefully eliminate every strong point. They bypassed them. German positions that once would have anchored a defensive line were suddenly left isolated in the rear as American armor raced forward at astonishing speed, sometimes 50 or even 60 miles in a single day. Headquarters were overrun, supply depots captured, communication lines shattered. For German commanders, it was chaos. Every time they tried to assemble a counterattack, American fighter bombers swooped down from the sky, tearing apart their columns before they even reached the battlefield. And suddenly the terrifying truth was impossible to ignore. The German army wasn't being defeated in a single dramatic battle. It was being systematically dismantled hour by hour, mile by mile, by a machine that never slowed down. Once the German line cracked during Operation Cobra, the war in Western Europe changed overnight. What followed wasn't just a retreat. It was a pursuit, one of the fastest military advances in modern history. American armored columns surged through the shattered front like a flood bursting through a broken dam. At the center of it all was Patton's Third Army racing across France, with a speed that left German commanders stunned. In some sectors, American forces advanced hundreds of miles in just days. To the Germans, this seemed almost impossible. Armies weren't supposed to move this fast. Traditional military doctrine said large offensives slowed down as supply lines stretched thin. But the Americans had solved that problem before it even appeared. Behind the front lines, an enormous logistical operation roared into action, the Red Ball Express. With French railroads destroyed and bridges damaged, the Allies created a massive highway network dedicated entirely to supply convoys. Thousands upon thousands of trucks drove in endless loops 24 hours a day, engines roaring through dust and darkness. Many of the drivers were African-American soldiers of the Quartermaster Corps of men, who worked under exhausting conditions to keep the front lines moving. Every day, they delivered thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts. And because of that constant flow, the American advance never slowed. German commanders would establish what they believed was a strong defensive position along a river, expecting it would take the Allies weeks to gather bridging equipment and forces. But when morning came, they sometimes discovered something astonishing. American combat engineers had already built pontoon bridges overnight, often under enemy fire. And by dawn, entire armored divisions were already across the river, appearing deep in the German rear. To German officers trained in the traditional European style of warfare, it felt as if the Americans had somehow broken the fundamental rules of war itself: speed, scale, relentless pressure. The battlefield was no longer moving at the pace of marching infantry and horse-drawn wagons. It was moving at the speed of engines, fuel, and factories. And the German army was being dragged into a kind of war it had never been built to survive. As the American advance tore across France, German commanders began to realize they were facing a problem far more dangerous than a breakthrough. They were facing a war they could no longer afford to fight. Every engagement followed the same brutal pattern. A German unit might fight brilliantly. Their officers were still tactically superb. Their soldiers were experienced, disciplined, and often fought with remarkable courage. But even when they won a local battle, they were still losing the war, because every German success came with a price they could not pay. Every counterattack burned precious fuel that Germany barely had. Every artillery barrage emptied ammunition stocks that couldn't be easily replaced. Every destroyed panzer meant one less tank Germany would ever field again. Meanwhile, the Americans kept coming. German intelligence officers studying captured American field manuals were stunned by what they found. U.S. doctrine assumed levels of supply consumption that German planners considered completely impossible. American offensives calculated ammunition usage at 2 or even 3 times what German doctrine considered sustainable. To German quartermasters, it looked insane. But it worked because America could afford it. If a German division lost tanks in battle, replacing them could take months, if replacements even existed. When an American tank broke down, mechanics often pulled the entire engine out, dropped in a new one, and sent the damaged engine back to a rear depot for rebuilding. If American units suffered casualties, fresh replacements arrived, constantly drawn from a massive training pipeline back in the United States. The American system treated war almost like an industrial process. Machines were replaced, parts were swapped. The line kept moving. German commanders, by contrast, relied heavily on veteran soldiers who had trained and fought together for years. These experienced fighters were irreplaceable. Once they were gone, their units slowly became hollow shells, and by the fall of 1944, that reality was becoming painfully clear. German divisions that had once been feared across Europe were shrinking short on men, low on fuel, and desperately holding fragile defensive lines. American divisions, meanwhile, kept returning to the battlefield fully replenished. To some German generals, the conclusion was becoming unavoidable. This was no longer a contest of tactics. It was a contest of industrial endurance. And in that kind of war, the outcome had already been decided. By the winter of 1944, Germany was cornered. Its armies were retreating across Europe, its factories were under relentless bombing, and its fuel reserves were nearly gone. Many German generals already knew the truth. The war was slipping beyond recovery. But Adolf Hitler refused to accept it. Instead, he ordered one final desperate gamble. The plan was bold, almost reckless launch, a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, the same rugged terrain German forces had used to shock the world in 1940. If the attack succeeded, German armored divisions would punch through the American lines, race toward the vital port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. Cut off the British and American forces in the north, Hitler believed, and the Allies might be forced into a negotiated peace. In December 1944, under the cover of a massive snowstorm that grounded Allied aircraft, the German army struck. The surprise was complete. Elite panzer divisions smashed into thinly held American lines, carving a huge bulge into the Allied front. Entire American units were surrounded, supply routes were cut, and thousands of prisoners were taken. For a few tense days, it looked like the German army of 1940 had returned. But the German plan depended on one critical assumption: that the Americans would panic, that their command system would collapse under pressure, that their soldiers would break. None of that happened. At the key crossroads town of Bastogne, the surrounded American 101st Airborne Division was ordered by the Germans to surrender. The American commander's reply became legendary. One word: nuts. Outnumbered, freezing, and running low on ammunition, the paratroopers simply held their ground. And while they fought, the American machine began moving again. Entire armies were suddenly redirected toward the battlefield. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army had been preparing for an attack in a completely different direction, received new orders: turn north and relieve Bastogne. Military planners said it couldn't be done. Reorganizing an army of that size would take a week. Patton gave them 48 hours. And then the trucks started moving. Columns of American armor and infantry drove day and night across icy roads, smashing into the German flank with a speed that stunned even their own commanders. Then the weather cleared, and the sky filled with Allied aircraft. Fighter bombers swarmed over German supply columns, destroying fuel trucks, tanks, and artillery. The powerful panzer divisions that had driven so deeply into the Allied lines slowly ground to a halt. Not because they had been defeated in battle, but because they had run out of fuel. Hitler's final gamble had failed, and with it, Germany had lost the last reserves it had left to fight the war. The failure of the Ardennes offensive marked a turning point the German High Command could no longer deny. Germany had gambled everything: its last elite panzer divisions, its final fuel reserves, its most experienced crews. And when the attack collapsed, those losses were permanent. For Germany, Every destroyed tank was irreplaceable. Every veteran crew lost in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes was gone forever. The factories that once fed the Wehrmacht had been reduced to rubble by relentless Allied bombing. But on the other side of the battlefield, the situation was completely different. When American divisions took heavy losses during the battle, replacements began arriving almost immediately. Fresh soldiers crossed the Atlantic every week. New tanks rolled out of factories in Detroit. Aircraft left assembly lines in California and Texas. Within weeks, battered American units were rebuilt and ready to fight again. The pipeline never stopped. 3,000 miles away, American industry continued to pour out trucks, ammunition engines, rifles, radios, uniforms, and fuel at a scale the German war economy could no longer dream of matching. German officers watching the battlefield began to describe the enemy in a new way. Not as an army, but as a machine. A German victory might destroy an American division, but that division would be rebuilt. An American victory, however, erased a German division forever. This was the brutal mathematics of attrition, and the numbers were merciless. The Wehrmacht was slowly being ground down, battle after battle, while the American war machine only grew stronger. By early 1945, the final outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany wasn't just losing the war. It was being crushed by the weight of an industrial giant that simply could not be exhausted. By early 1945, the German army was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to survive. Across the Western Front, the once feared Wehrmacht was collapsing under relentless pressure. Divisions that had once conquered Europe were now shadows of their former strength, short on ammunition, starving for fuel, and desperately scraping together replacements. Many of those replacements were no longer seasoned soldiers. They were teenagers, old men, members of the Volkssturm, the People's Army, armed with simple Panzerfaust rockets and little training, thrown into battle in a final desperate attempt to slow the Allied advance. Meanwhile, the American war machine kept rolling forward. Fresh divisions continued to arrive in Europe, fully equipped with brand new tanks, trucks, artillery, and aircraft. American soldiers on the front lines often received hot meals, steady ammunition, and constant resupply, something German troops could barely imagine by that stage of the war. For German officers who had spent their entire lives studying warfare, the contrast was staggering. On the Eastern Front, they had faced the Soviet Union's endless waves of manpower, an ocean of soldiers willing to endure unimaginable losses. But fighting the Americans felt different. German veterans began describing it in simple terms. Facing the Russians meant confronting human waves. Facing the Americans meant confronting a machine. A machine of trucks, aircraft, artillery factories, and supply lines stretching across an entire ocean. If you held a position against the Americans, the result was always the same. First came the artillery, then the bombs, then the tanks, and eventually, no matter how strong the defense was, the position would be reduced to rubble. Because the Americans had something the German army no longer possessed: time, fuel, ammunition, and an industrial engine that simply never stopped producing the tools of war. By the spring of 1945, the end of the war in Europe was approaching with unstoppable momentum. The German army still fought, but the reality was impossible to ignore. Their forces were shattered, their supplies exhausted, and their once brilliant war machine was collapsing under the weight of a conflict it could no longer sustain. One final natural barrier still stood between the Allied armies and the heart of Germany: the Rhine River. For centuries, the Rhine had been considered Germany's great defensive shield, a wide, powerful river protecting the industrial core of the nation. German commanders believed it could slow the Allied advance, buying precious time to reorganize what remained of their battered forces. But the Americans approached the problem the same way they had approached every obstacle during the war: not as an impossible barrier, but as another logistical problem waiting to be solved. Artillery batteries thundered across the riverbanks, unleashing barrages on a scale rarely seen before. Allied aircraft dominated the skies, hammering German defenses day and night. Meanwhile, American combat engineers moved with astonishing speed. Under fire, they assembled massive pontoon bridges across the river steel pathways thrown over the Rhine almost overnight. What German planners expected to take weeks took days. Soon, American tanks, trucks, and infantry began pouring across the river in massive numbers, spreading through western Germany like a rising tide. At that point, resistance no longer looked like organized defense. It looked like collapse. Cities fell, one after another. German units surrendered by the thousands. Entire formations simply disintegrated as the American advance pushed deeper into the heart of the Reich. For the German High Command, the realization was finally complete. They had not lost because their soldiers lacked courage. They had lost because they had been fighting something entirely new: an enemy that had turned an entire nation into a war machine. Looking back on the war, many German officers struggled to explain what had happened. On paper, they still believed their soldiers were among the finest in the world, better trained, more disciplined, and tactically superior. In many battles, German units had fought with remarkable skill and courage. But by 1945, those qualities no longer mattered, because the Americans had changed the very nature of war. German commanders had been raised in a military culture built on tradition, centuries of strategy, discipline, and battlefield mastery. Victory was supposed to come from brilliant maneuvers, experienced officers, and hardened soldiers. The Americans approached the problem differently. They treated war like an industrial equation. If a problem appeared on the battlefield, they didn't rely on heroic charges or daring tactics. They solved it with firepower, logistics, and production. A stubborn machine gun nest wasn't assaulted, it was erased by artillery. A destroyed tank wasn't repaired, it was replaced. A battered division wasn't left to recover, it was refilled with new men and equipment and sent back into the fight. Everything about the American system was designed to keep the machine running, endlessly, relentlessly. And that, in the end, was the lesson Germany learned too late. They had prepared for a war of brilliant soldiers and decisive battles. Instead, they found themselves facing something entirely different. A nation that had weaponized its factories, its roads, its engineers, its workers, and turned all of it into a force that could grind down even the most experienced army on earth. 3:17 a.m. over the English Channel. A British pilot dives for his life only to see something impossible in his mirror. Not a Messerschmitt, not a Spitfire, a small, round-nosed fighter ripping through the sky like it owns it. Within weeks, RAF losses surge. Veterans can't outclimb it, can't outrun it, can't outfight it. Out of nowhere, Germany has unleashed a predator. This is the story of the FW-190, the aircraft that nearly stole the sky. In 1937, while Europe was still pretending war could be avoided, the German Air Ministry issued a simple request. They wanted a new fighter, not to replace the Bf-109, but to fight beside it. Most designers followed the same instinct: smaller, lighter, faster. Sleek lines, minimal drag. A racing machine built for speed and altitude. But one man saw the future differently. Kurt Tank, a veteran of the First World War tank, had seen what combat really did to machines. He had watched equipment fail in mud and snow under artillery fire. He knew war was not fought on perfect runways under perfect conditions. He didn't want a racehorse that needed careful grooming. He wanted a warhorse, an aircraft that could lift off from cratered frontline strips. One that could take hits and still carry its pilot home. One that mechanics with minimal training could keep operational in brutal conditions. So he made a bold decision. He chose a radial engine. Many considered it outdated, bulky, drag-heavy, old-fashioned. Europe's fastest fighters were using sleek, liquid-cooled inline engines. But tanks saw something others didn't. A radial engine was tougher, less vulnerable to catastrophic coolant loss, less likely to burst into flames from a single bullet. He paired it with wide-track landing gear for stability and a reinforced airframe built to endure punishment. Then the prototype flew, and the skepticism began to fade. It was fast, shockingly fast, at low and medium altitudes. It accelerated hard. It felt solid, aggressive, almost muscular in the air. At the altitudes where real dogfights happened, it wasn't just competitive. It was dominant. That warhorse had a name, Focke-Wulf 190, and soon it would make the skies over England tremble. And by the fall of 1941, the warhorse arrived. The first Focke-Wulf 190s were delivered quietly to Jagdgeschwader 26 Adolf Galland's unit stationed along the French coast. To the German pilots, it felt like Christmas morning. To the British, it would feel like Judgment Day. At first, the RAF didn't even realize the balance of power had shifted. Spitfire Mark V's were flying aggressive sweeps over northern France. The tide, it seemed, was finally turning. After the bitter grind of the Battle of Britain Fighter Command was pushing deeper across the Channel, confidence was rising. Then came September. During routine rhubarb missions, low-level strikes meant to harass German positions, RAF pilots began reporting encounters with something new. It was smaller than a bomber, round-nosed, radial engine, and impossibly fast. One Spitfire pilot later described it bluntly. It simply ran away from us. That had never happened before. The Bf-109 could climb. It could dive. But it couldn't just disappear at low altitude. This new fighter could. It accelerated like it had been kicked by a mule. It rolled faster. It hit harder. 4 cannons could tear through a Spitfire in seconds. British intelligence dismissed the early reports. Perhaps it was a captured French Curtiss Hawk. Maybe an upgraded export model. The men in the cockpit knew better. This wasn't captured. This was purpose-built. Within weeks, losses mounted. Veteran RAF squadrons found themselves outmatched in the very airspace they had begun to dominate. Engagements that once ended in even trades now tilted sharply in Germany's favor. And then came the Channel Dash. February 1942. 2 German battleships made a daring run through the English Channel in broad daylight. The Royal Navy and RAF scrambled everything they had. FAW-19 OTAs led the escort. Wave after wave of British aircraft attacked and were driven back. Swordfish torpedo bombers were slaughtered. Spitfires struggled to gain the upper hand. Gallen's unit alone claimed multiple kills for minimal losses. It was a humiliation Britain would not forget. For 6 long months, the FW-190 ruled the low and medium altitudes over Western Europe. RAF Air Vice Marshal Johnny Johnson would later admit, yes, it caused real problems. You could outturn it, but you couldn't turn forever. And that was the truth of it. The FW-190 didn't need to outturn you. It only needed one pass, one burst, one mistake. The warhorse had become a predator, and the sky over France belonged to it. For months, the Focke-Wulf 190 had ruled the channel. RAF patrols were pushed back toward the English coast. Penetrations into France grew shorter. Confidence faded. The warhorse had done exactly what Kurt Tank designed it to do: dominate the fight where it mattered most. But wars are not decided by machines alone. They are decided by men. And in the summer of 1942, one man made a mistake that would echo across the rest of the war. His name was Armin Faber. Unlike the hardened aces of J.G., Faber wasn't a frontline legend. He was an administrative officer, paperwork, orders, logistics. On June 23, 1942, he received special permission to join a combat mission, a rare chance to prove himself in the cockpit of Germany's most feared fighter. The mission intercepted British light bombers over the channel. The sky erupted into chaos. Spitfires from No. 31 O Squadron arrived to defend the bombers, and within seconds, the calm formation shattered into twisting contrails and cannon fire. Faber found himself with a Spitfire on his tail. He did what instinct told him dived. The FW-190 responded beautifully. The radial engine roared. The aircraft accelerated hard, slicing through the air with terrifying speed. The Spitfire stayed with him. In desperation, Faber attempted a maneuver he had only read about: an aggressive head-on engagement. It worked. Cannon fire flashed. The Spitfire exploded past him, its pilot forced to bail out. In a strange moment of chivalry, Faber circled once and saluted the descending parachute before flying on. It should have been a triumphant first kill. Instead, it became a disaster. Disoriented from the fight and inexperienced in navigation, Faber flew north, believing he was heading back toward France. He wasn't. He was flying deeper into England. Moments later, he spotted an airfield below. Convinced it was friendly, he performed a victory roll overhead. No flak, no resistance. He lowered his landing gear and touched down smoothly. Ground crew approached casually, signaling where to park. Only then did Faber realize the truth. The uniforms weren't German. He had landed at an RAF training base. Stunned British personnel climbed onto the wing and took him prisoner alongside something far more valuable: an intact Focke-Wulf 190. For the RAF, it was the intelligence breakthrough of the year. Until that moment, the 190 had been a mystery, a predator glimpsed in flashes of gunfire. Now British engineers could test it, dissect it, fly it. They could measure its climb rate, its roll rate, its weaknesses at altitude. And they found them. The warhorse was powerful at low level, but above 20,000 feet, it struggled. Its small wings, so deadly in tight, low-altitude fights, became a liability in thin air. The balance of the air war had shifted once before. Now quietly, it began to shift again. Because the Allies had finally seen the Predator up close, and they were already preparing something that would drag the fight higher into the cold, unforgiving sky, where the FW-190 was no longer king. The British had studied the Predator. They had measured its claws. They had mapped its strengths. And most importantly, they had found its weakness. But it wasn't Britain that would truly change the fight. It was America. By the spring of 1943, a new sound began echoing over England, deep, steady, mechanical. 4 engines. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress had arrived. Soon after came the B-24 Liberator. Massive formations of heavy bombers climbed into the European sky in broad daylight, heading straight for the industrial heart of the Reich. At first, the FW-190 adapted beautifully. This was what it had been built for: brutal direct combat. Its radial engine absorbed punishment from .50 caliber fire better than liquid-cooled fighters. Its cannons tore through aluminum skin and fuel tanks. German pilots modified the aircraft into bomber destroyers, adding 30mm cannons, even unguided rockets, and the results were devastating. American bombers fell in flames across Western Europe. Entire formations were shredded. The early missions were bloodbaths, but the Americans were learning. They realized something painful: bombers alone could not survive. So they brought Guardians. First came long-range Spitfires. Then the Americans sent their own escorts, the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt and the twin-boomed P-38 Lightning. And suddenly the fight moved higher. 20,000 feet, 25,000, into the thin, freezing air. Up there, the FW-190's dominance began to crack. Its compact wings, so lethal at low altitude, lost their edge in the stratosphere. The Thunderbolt, massive and turbo-supercharged, thrived where the German fighter gasped. At 10,000 feet and above, the balance tilted. At 25,000, it shifted decisively. German pilots, who once dictated the terms of battle, now found themselves defending. Then came the final blow. The P-51 Mustang. With range enough to escort bombers deep into Germany and performance strong at high altitude, it erased the Luftwaffe's last sanctuary. The skies over the Reich were no longer German territory. The FW-190 was still dangerous, still deadly in the right hands. But now it faced escorts that could climb with it, dive with it, and stay with it all the way home. The Predator had been dragged into a new arena, higher, colder, less forgiving. And for the first time since 1941, the warhorse was fighting on ground that did not favor it. The sky over Germany was no longer blue. It was silver. Silver with thousands of contrails. Silver with endless bomber streams stretching to the horizon. And weaving through them Mustangs. The FW-190 was still in the fight, but now it was bleeding. German commanders knew the truth. The warhorse had been dragged too high for too long. If the Reich was going to survive the daylight bombing campaign, they needed something new. Something that could claw back altitude performance without sacrificing firepower. The answer became the FEW-190D. They called it the Dora. The nose was longer now, housing the powerful Jumo 213 inline engine. Sleeker, faster at altitude. The cockpit pressurized. The climb improved. At 25,000 feet, it could finally stand toe-to-toe with the Mustang. When the first Doris entered combat in late 1944, the results were promising. On one of its earliest operational sorties, the new variant tore into a British bomber formation, downing multiple aircraft with minimal loss. For a moment, it felt like 1941 again. But moments were all Germany had left. Fuel shortages crippled training. Veteran pilots were dead captured or exhausted. Replacements climbed into Doris with barely enough flight hours to survive takeoff, let alone dual-seasoned Allied aces. Then came January 1st, 1945, Operation Bodenplatte, a desperate all-in strike against Allied airfields in the West. Hundreds of German fighters, including FW-190s, swept low across the front in a surprise attack. They destroyed aircraft on the ground, but the cost was catastrophic. Over 250 German fighters were lost in a single day, many of them irreplaceable. More devastating than the machines were the pilots. Experienced squadron leaders, veterans of years of combat, gone. The Luftwaffe would never recover. Even as the final evolution, the TA-152, with its stretched wings and high-altitude refinement, entered service. It came too late. Fewer than 100 would ever fly. They showed flashes of brilliance. They won isolated duels. But the war was already decided. The FW-190 had been one of the most formidable fighters of the conflict, innovative, lethal, adaptable. In the right conditions, it was superior to nearly anything it faced. But no aircraft fights alone against an industrial giant. By 1945, the skies belonged to overwhelming numbers, endless fuel, and relentless production. The warhorse had fought hard, but it had been fighting for the wrong side of history. By the spring of 1945, the roar of the Focke-Wulf 190 was fading. Airfields that once launched wave after wave of radial engine fighters were now cratered, burning, or abandoned. Fuel was scarce, spare parts scarcer. The once proud Jagdgeschwader that had ruled the Channel scrambled merely to get aircraft airborne. And yet, even in defeat, the FW-190 refused to disappear quietly. On the Eastern Front, it continued to strike Soviet armor and ground columns with ruthless efficiency. In the West, the last operational Doris and TA-152s still rose to challenge bomber streams when they could. In the hands of experienced pilots, the aircraft remained deadly fast, heavily armed, and unforgiving in a dive. But war is not decided by moments of brilliance. It is decided by momentum. And momentum now belonged entirely to the Allies. American factories were producing aircraft by the thousands. New Mustangs rolled off assembly lines faster than Germany could replace trained pilots. Every loss for the Luftwaffe was permanent. Every Allied loss was temporary. The FW-190 had evolved constantly throughout the warfighter bomber interceptor ground attack platform. It had adapted to new threats, new altitudes, new missions. Few aircraft were as versatile. Few were as feared at their peak. From 1941 over the Channel to 1943 against the flying fortresses to 1944 defending a collapsing Reich. It had been there. But by 1945, even the finest warhorse cannot outrun history. Some FW-190s ended in flames over Germany. Others were abandoned on runways as Allied troops advanced. A handful were captured intact, studied, and flown by the very nations they once fought. steel and aluminum, rivets and engines. That is what remains of a machine. But what lingers longer are the men who flew it, the veterans who trusted its strength, the rookies who climbed into its cockpit with barely enough training, and the enemies who faced it and survived. The FW-190 did not lose because it was inferior. It lost because it fought a war of attrition against an industrial superpower, and because by the end, there were too few skilled hands left to harness its full potential. In the cold arithmetic of history, that is the final verdict. The warhorse was powerful, it was innovative, it was lethal, but even the most formidable predator cannot win when the sky itself turns against it. By January 1st, 1945, the warhorse was no longer charging. It was cornered. Operation Bodenplatte had been a gamble, one last violent swing meant to cripple Allied air power on the ground. FW-1019Os roared low across enemy lines, at dawn strafing airfields, destroying parked aircraft, scattering mechanics and ground crews. For a few brief hours, it looked like a comeback. Then the cost became clear. More than 250 German fighters lost in a single day, many of them FW-190As. Worse than the machines were the men, seasoned leaders, veterans of France, Britain, Russia, gone in a morning. The Luftwaffe did not have replacements. And so, the sky began to empty. Some FW-190Os were shot down by Mustangs at altitude. Others were torn apart by anti-aircraft fire as they dove on ground targets in desperation. A few were credited on simple pieces of paper, typed certificates from American flak batteries, confirming another German fighter destroyed. One aircraft, one burst of fire, one more symbol of a collapsing air force. By the spring of 1945, the once feared predator was often seen burning on frozen runways, abandoned for lack of fuel, or captured intact by advancing Allied troops. And yet, even in defeat, the FW-190 commanded respect. Allied test pilots who flew, captured examples admitted it was formidable, solid, aggressive, deadly in the right envelope. At low and medium altitude, it had once been unmatched. As a bomber interceptor, it had drawn blood from the mighty flying fortresses. As a ground attack platform, it had punished armor and infantry alike. It had adapted. It had evolved. It had fought everywhere, but it had fought alone against time, against factories that never slept, against fuel shortages that strangled training, against a war that turned into a numbers game Germany could never win. By May 1945, the engines were silent. The Focke-Wulf 190, once the terror of the Channel, had become wreckage, museum pieces, scattered relics of a fallen Reich. Steel does not choose sides. Pilots do. And in the end, the warhorse that once dominated the sky became a reminder of a simple truth. Even the most lethal machine cannot change the outcome of a war already lost. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Focke-Wulf 190 did not vanish. It lingered, scattered across shattered airfields, parked in forests beneath camouflage nets that would never be removed, burned out hulks along frozen runways in the east. Captured examples flown carefully by Allied test pilots who wanted to understand the machine that had once terrified their squadrons. To many of those Allied pilots, the verdict was surprisingly consistent. The FW-190 had been no myth, It was powerful, exceptionally well-armed, stable in a dive, devastating at low and medium altitude. It could roll faster than almost anything in the sky in 1941. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it was a predator that demanded respect. It had forced the RAF to adapt. It had forced the Americans to rethink escort strategy. It had forced the Allies to drag the war higher into the thin air, where industrial power could finally tip the scales. And that may be its greatest legacy. The FW-190 didn't just fight the war, it shaped it. From the shock over the Channel, to the burning bomber streams over Germany, to the desperate last flights of the Dora und TA-152. It was there at every turning point, but history is unforgiving on you. Germany could design brilliance. It could engineer innovation under pressure. Yet it could not outproduce the combined weight of American factories, British resilience, and Soviet manpower. In the end, the FW-190 became a symbol of something larger. A machine ahead of its time. A weapon of remarkable adaptability. A warhorse that never stopped evolving. And yet, like so many weapons of the Second World War, it serves as a reminder that technology alone does not decide destiny. Men do, leadership does, industry does. Today, the few surviving FW-190s rest in museums, polished and silent. Visitors look at the wide landing gear, the muscular nose, the compact wings, and imagine what it must have felt like to sit inside that cockpit in 1941, heart-pounding, knowing you were flying the most feared fighter in Western Europe. For a moment, the sky belonged to it. And though it ultimately fell with the Reich, it served the legend of the Focke-Wulf. 190 endures not as a symbol of victory, but as a testament to how quickly the balance of power in war can shift, and how even the fiercest predator can be overtaken by the tide of history. For a brief, violent moment in history, the sky belonged to the Focke-Wulf 190. It arrived without warning in 1941 and shattered British confidence over the Channel. It mauled bomber formations in 1943. It evolved again and again into new forms: interceptor, ground attacker, high-altitude duelist. It adapted. It endured. It fought on every major front of the European war. But in the end, even the most formidable warhorse cannot outrun fate. By 1945, Germany was no longer fighting for air superiority, it was fighting for survival. Airfields were cratered, fuel trains bombed, pilots rushed through training with barely enough hours to master takeoff, let alone combat. The FW-190D and the rare TA-152 showed flashes of brilliance, proving the design still had teeth. But brilliance without numbers is a dying flame in a hurricane. Across the Channel and beyond, Allied factories roared day and night. For every FW-190 destroyed, dozens of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Spitfires rolled off assembly lines. For every veteran Luftwaffe ace lost, the pool of experience shrank further until the machine itself outlived the men capable of unleashing its full potential. And that is the final truth of the FW-190. It was not defeated because it was inferior. It was defeated because war had become industrial. Because the sky was no longer won by the best fighter, but by the side that could build fuel and replace thousands more. Yet history does not forget excellence. The Focke-Wulf 190 remains one of the most lethal and versatile fighter aircraft of the Second World War. A design born from hard lessons, built for punishment, and feared by those who faced it at low altitude. For a time, it rewrote the rules of the air war. Then the rules changed again. Today, its surviving airframe sits silent under museum lights. No cannon fire, no engine roar, just polished aluminum and memory. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The radial engine spooling up, the canopy locking shut, the warhorse charging once more into a sky that would never again be the same. Steel does not feel fear. It does not hesitate before takeoff. It does not write letters home. But the men inside the Focke-Wulf 190 did. In 1941, many of them were confident, seasoned pilots who had flown over Poland, France, Britain. When they first pushed the throttle forward on the new radial-powered fighter, they felt invincible. The aircraft responded like a living thing, strong in the climb, vicious in the dive. They trusted it. Some even loved it. It brought them home. But by 1944, the cockpit told a different story. The veterans were thinning out. Faces in the ready room grew younger. Boys barely out of training climbed into Doras with fewer than 100 flight hours. They had read about Galland. They had heard the legends of 1941. Now they were expected to fight Mustangs at 25,000 feet. Fuel shortages meant fewer training flights. Spare parts were rationed. Some took off knowing they might not have enough gasoline for a second engagement. Others knew their squadron leader, the man who taught them how to survive, had been shot down the week before. The FW-190 was still lethal, but it could not compensate for inexperience. It could not replace instinct forged in years of combat. Inside that armored cockpit, beneath the thick canopy glass, hands still trembled, not because the machine was weak, but because the war had turned against them. Across the sky, American pilots were just as human. They too wrote letters. They too carried photographs tucked into flight jackets. When they faced the FW-190, they respected it. They learned its habits. They studied its roll rate, its dive, its firepower. And then they adapted. Because war is not just machines colliding in the clouds. It is young men on both sides trusting metal and fuel with their lives. When we look back at the Focke-Wulf 190 today, it's easy to admire the engineering. The wide landing gear, the muscular nose, the heavy cannons. But history is quieter than that. It remembers the pilots who never returned, the rookies who climbed into the cockpit for the first time, the veterans who survived long enough to see the sky change. In the end, the FW-190 was steel and fire. But it was the men inside the machine who carried the weight of the war. February 8, 1945. In the frozen heart of Nazi Germany, where rockets were built and prisoners were meant to die, forgotten, one starving Soviet pilot refused to disappear. Barely strong enough to stand, Mikhail Devyatayev climbed into an enemy bomber he had never flown and gambled 10 lives on one impossible takeoff. What followed was not just an escape. It was a desperate act of courage that turned a broken prisoner into a legend. 1st February 8, 1945. Snow drifts across a frozen runway on the Baltic coast of Nazi Germany. Guard towers stand rigid, machine guns face outward. This is Peenemünde, a place built for rocket secrecy and death. No prisoner is ever meant to leave this airfield alive. A man weighing just 84 pounds walks across the snow in striped rags. His name is Mikhail Devyatayev. He has not eaten a full meal in 8 months. His arms tremble when he raises them. His body is failing fast. In exactly 47 minutes, this dying prisoner will attempt to steal a German bomber from one of the most heavily defended military bases in Europe. Waiting on the tarmac is a Heinkel I-111. 2 engines, a 74-foot wingspan, more than 100 switches labeled in a language he cannot read. The aircraft was designed for trained Luftwaffe crews, not starving concentration camp prisoners who can barely stand upright. To lift this bomber off the ground, a pilot must pull the control column with 50 pounds of force. Devyatayev weighs less than that. He has never flown a German aircraft. He has never touched these controls. He has no weapons, no radio, no map, and no margin for error. Behind him are 9 other prisoners, men so starved they have forgotten what strength feels like. Men who know that failure means immediate execution. This is not a mission approved by any command. It is a final act of defiance by men who refuse to die quietly. And before this hour ends, this frozen runway will witness one of the most impossible escapes of World War II. 6 months earlier, this man was not a prisoner. He was a Soviet fighter pilot carving through the sky over occupied Europe. Lieutenant Mikhail Devyatayev flew a Yak-1 with 17 confirmed kills. He was decorated, respected, one of the best. Then in July 1944, German fighters caught him above Lviv. Cannon fire tore into his engine. His aircraft fell. His war changed forever. He bailed out at 2,000 feet. German soldiers were waiting when he hit the ground. At first, he was treated as a prisoner of war, but Devyatayev could not stop being a pilot. He tried to escape. He failed. He tried again, failed again. Each attempt brought harsher punishment. After the 3rd attempt, the Germans stopped calling him a POW. They labeled him dangerous. He was sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. 30,000 prisoners, gas chambers, smoke rising every night from the crematorium. Prisoners worked 12 hours a day on 700 calories. The average man lasted 4 months. Devyatayev arrived in late summer and watched strong men collapse beside him, watched bodies disappear. He understood the truth quickly. Stay here and die. By the fall of 1944, his weight dropped to 38 kilograms. His muscles consumed themselves. His rank was gone. His name erased. He was no longer a pilot in the eyes of the world. Only a number stitched onto striped cloth. But inside his head, something remained untouched. He still saw runways, still heard engines, still believed the sky was the only way out. Then the Germans made a mistake. They needed skilled labor for a secret facility. Men who understood machines. Devyatayev volunteered without hesitation. He did not know where they were sending him. He did not care. Anywhere was better than waiting for smoke to rise with his name in it. The transport arrived at night. No signs, no explanations, just silenced dogs and shouted German orders. When morning came, Devyatayev understood exactly where the Nazis had sent him. Towers of concrete rose from the forest. Then the ground shook. A rocket lifted into the sky like a steel spear fire and smoke trailing behind it. This was Peenemünde, the most advanced weapons research center in Nazi Germany, the birthplace of the V1 and V-2 missiles that were raining terror on London. A place guarded not just by fences and guns, but by secrecy. Few outsiders ever saw it. Fewer ever left. Deviatayev was assigned to slave labor at the airfield beside the rocket facility. From dawn to dusk, he hauled equipment and cleared snow under armed watch. But his eyes were never on the ground. They were on the sky. He watched bombers parked on the tarmac, Messerschmitt fighters taxiing to the runway, transport aircraft coming and going at all hours. Among them, one aircraft stood out, a Heinkel He 111 marked with the letters GA on its fuselage. It was always fueled, always ready. It belonged to the deputy commandant, kept in constant readiness for urgent flights. To the guards, it was just another machine. To Deviatayev, it was a door. He knew the odds. Prisoners at Peenemünde survived 8 weeks on average. He had already been there 3. There would be no tunnels, no forged papers, no cutting fences. If he was going to escape this place, it would not be on foot. It would be through the air. From that moment on, every work detail became reconnaissance. Deviatayev did not see himself as a slave laborer. He saw himself as a pilot behind enemy lines. While others kept their heads down, he watched everything. Which aircraft were fueled? Which ones flew daily? Which guards paid attention and which did not? He studied the Heinkel the only way he could. From a distance, he watched German pilots climb into the cockpit and run their pre-flight checks. He memorized the order of their hands, left to right, up then down, switches first, then gauges, then ignition. He did not know the words, but he learned the rhythm. Over and over again, the Heinkel He 111 was nothing like the fighters he had flown. 2 engines instead of 1. Heavier, slower to respond, less forgiving. The cockpit held more than 100 controls, all labeled in German. A single mistake during startup could flood the engines or drain the batteries. A mistake during takeoff could kill everyone on board. At night, exhausted and half-starved, Deviatayev replayed the cockpit in his mind. He imagined sitting in the pilot seat, reaching for switches he had never touched, feeling the vibration of the engines. He knew he would not get a second chance. When the moment came, the aircraft would either fly or become his grave. He also understood one hard truth. He could not do this alone. Stealing a bomber would require more than courage. It would require trust in a place designed to destroy it. And inside a concentration camp, trust was the rarest thing of all. Finding accomplices inside a concentration camp was more dangerous than any guard tower. Desperation turned prisoners into informants. A whispered rumor could buy extra bread. A careless word could mean a beating or a bullet. Deviatayev knew that one wrong choice would kill them all before the plan even began. He started with men who had already crossed the line of fear, prisoners who had tried to escape before and paid for it in blood, men who no longer believed survival came from obedience. The first was a former Soviet sergeant, a big man even after months of starvation. He had been beaten nearly to death twice for escaping other camps. He did not hesitate. Death was coming either way. At least this way it would be on his feet. Others followed slowly, one at a time. A tank mechanic who understood engines and listened more than he spoke. An infantryman, small, quick, and alert. An artillery observer, who stayed calm when everything went wrong. Each man was tested with small conversations, careful questions, long silences. No plan was revealed until loyalty was certain. In total, there would be 10 of them, 10 prisoners against an entire airbase. They had no weapons to overpower guards, no tools to force locks, no training on German aircraft. What they shared was something far more dangerous, nothing left to lose. The plan they agreed to was simple and insane. No tunnels, no fences, no hiding. They would walk straight through the center of the base in broad daylight and steal an aircraft. The guards did not defend against impossible ideas. And Devyatayev was counting on that blindness to carry them into the sky. Every detail had to be perfect because none of them would get a second chance. Devyatayev laid out the plan without promises and without comfort. He told them the truth. Most of them would probably die. But staying meant certain death. This was the only path that offered even a thin line of hope. Step 1 was silence. One guard, one moment of isolation. No gunshots, no alarms. The guard's uniform would be taken, his rifle left behind. They would not fight the base. They would walk through it. A work detail led by a guard was a sight seen every day at Peenemünde. Familiarity would be their camouflage. Step 2 was movement. They would march across the airfield in formation, heads down, tools in hand. No running, no hesitation. Any sign of panic would draw attention. If challenged, the man in uniform would bark orders in broken German and keep moving. Confidence mattered more than perfect words. Step 3 was speed. Reach the aircraft marked GA. Neutralize anyone nearby. Get inside. Once the engines were running, the base would wake up. From that moment on, they would be racing alarms trucks and machine guns. Every second on the ground would push them closer to execution. Step 4 was the sky. Take off before the guards understood what was happening. Fly east. Do not engage. Do not land. Do not turn back. Somewhere beyond the clouds was the front line. Somewhere beyond it was survival. They chose the date carefully. February 8, 1945. Winter weather, low visibility, snow to soften outlines, and slow reactions. If the sky would not help them, nothing would. When the day was set, there were no speeches, no handshakes, just 10 men carrying a secret that would either set them free or bury them together. February 7th arrived cold and gray. Light snow fell across Peenemünde, blurring distance and muting sound. Visibility was poor, exactly what Devyatayev had hoped for. The kind of weather that made guards impatient and careless. The kind of weather where small movements disappeared into white space. That morning, the group was assigned to runway maintenance. 10 prisoners, 1 guard. A routine work detail that had moved across this airfield dozens of times before. Nothing about it looked dangerous. That was the point. Tools in hand, heads down, they walked onto the snow-covered concrete while watchtowers followed them without interest. The guard was young, new. He did not know their faces. He did not watch them closely. At 12:15, he stepped into a drainage ditch to relieve himself, hidden from the towers and alone with the prisoners for half a minute. That was all the time they would get. A shovel rose once, then fell. The guard collapsed without a sound. There was no celebration, no hesitation. They stripped the uniform from his body and pulled it onto one of their own. It fit poorly, too tight across the shoulders, but from a distance it would pass. The rifle was left behind. A weapon would raise suspicion. Authority, not firepower, was what they needed. The new guard took his place at the front. He shouted rough German orders learned by ear, not by grammar. The other 9 prisoners fell into line. Together they marched forward across the open airfield, hearts hammering, boots crunching in the snow. Ahead of them, 400 meters away, sat the aircraft that would decide whether this was the last walk of their lives or the first step toward freedom. They were halfway across the airfield when a real German guard appeared ahead of them, rifle on his shoulder, calm, curious. The group did not slow. The man in the stolen uniform barked an order that barely resembled proper German. His accent was wrong, his posture imperfect. For one frozen second, everything depended on whether the guard cared enough to ask questions. He did not. Peenemünde was full of foreign labor units, auxiliary troops, and unfamiliar faces. The guard shrugged and stepped aside. The prisoners walked past him at arm's length. No one spoke. No one looked back. Only when the distance opened again did they breathe. The aircraft was now close enough to touch. The Heinkel sat on the tarmac with its nose into the wind fuel tanks, full engines cold. 2 German mechanics worked beside it, hands black with oil, unaware that 10 dying men were walking straight toward them. Routine had blinded them. Nothing ever happened here, until now. At the last moment, the group broke formation. They moved as if ordered to service the aircraft. The mechanics looked up, confused mouths opening to speak. They never got the chance. Fists and elbows struck hard and fast. The mechanics collapsed into the snow, unconscious but alive. There was no time to check them. Deviatayev ran for the cockpit. The access door was unlocked. He climbed inside and sat down in the pilot seat. In front of him stretched a wall of instruments, switches and gauges, all labeled in German. He had minutes at most. Outside, 9 prisoners crowded into the aircraft, sealing the door behind them. And for the first time, the escape depended on a single man remembering everything he had ever watched and nothing he had ever been taught. The cockpit smelled of fuel and cold metal. Deviatayev's hands hovered over the controls, thin fingers shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. He had seen this done dozens of times, always from a distance. German pilots moving with confidence, flipping switches without hesitation. Now the distance was gone. Memorizing was over. This was execution. He began the sequence as he remembered it. Fuel, primer, ignition. Nothing happened. Outside, men were still loading themselves into the aircraft, crouching wherever there was space. Inside the cockpit, time slowed. Somewhere on the airfield, someone would notice 2 mechanics lying in the snow. When that happened, everything would collapse at once. He scanned the panel again, eyes racing across unfamiliar words. Then he saw it. A switch he had never fully understood, always flipped before the engines came alive. He reached for it and pulled it up. The instrument lights flickered. Power surged through the aircraft. He hit the ignition again. The left engine coughed, sputtered, then caught. The propeller spun into a gray blur. He repeated the sequence for the right engine. Another cough, another roar. Both engines were running now, vibrating through the airframe. The aircraft was alive. But starting it was only the beginning. Deviatayev had never taxied a twin-engine bomber in his life. And the moment the brakes were released, there would be no hiding what they had done. The wheel brakes released and the bomber began to roll. Too fast. The aircraft lurched forward heavier than anything Devyatayev had ever handled. He overcorrected, stamping on a brake. The bomber slewed sideways, nearly clipping another parked aircraft. Men in the back were thrown against the walls. Someone cursed. Someone prayed. Devyatayev forced his hands to slow down. Gentle pressure. Small corrections. The machine responded grudgingly. Shouts broke out behind them. A siren wailed. The base was waking up. A truck burst from behind a hangar, soldiers standing in the back, rifles already coming up. The distance to the runway collapsed in seconds. If the truck reached them before liftoff, it would end in gunfire or steel on steel. The bomber reached the center line. Devyatayev pushed both throttles forward. The engines howled. Snow and debris blasted behind them. The aircraft surged ahead, gathering speed. 100 kilometers per hour, 140. The end of the runway rushed toward them. He pulled back on the control column. It did not move. His body was too weak. Starvation had taken what strength he had left. He shouted for help. Two men forced their way forward and grabbed the controls with him. 3 bodies pulled as one. The column moved inches. Bullets cracked past the cockpit. Then the nose lifted just enough. The wheels left the ground. At 12:21, the bomber climbed into the gray sky, carrying 10 escaped prisoners away from the ground that was meant to kill them. For a heartbeat, there was silence. The runway fell away beneath them, the guards shrinking into the snow. Then the guns spoke. Peenemunde's air defenses opened fire, black bursts of flak tearing open the gray sky. Shrapnel rattled against the fuselage like thrown gravel. Devyatayev banked hard, first west, then north, trying to confuse anyone tracking their path. The bomber was heavy and slow to respond. Every turn felt delayed, as if the aircraft were arguing with him. Inside, the men braced themselves against the walls. One of them cried out as metal punched through the skin of the plane. Blood appeared on striped cloth. There were no medics, no bandages. Someone tore a strip from his uniform and pressed it into the wound. Clouds swallowed them. For 2 minutes, the flak followed, then faded. The engines droned on, uneven but alive. Devyatayev stared at the instruments, taking what little they could give him. Altitude, airspeed, a compass he could read. Everything else was noise. German labels, unknown systems. He flew by instinct and memory, keeping the nose pointed east. They were deep in enemy territory, more than 200 kilometers from the front. Fields and forests passed beneath them, roads crawling with vehicles. Every minute in the air was stolen time. Every vibration could be the last. Devyatayev pushed the throttles forward. Fuel was burning fast. But slowing down was not an option. Freedom was still far ahead, and the sky was not done trying to kill them. After nearly an hour in the air, the bomber began to fail. Smoke streamed from the left engine, dark and steady. Damage from the flak was finally catching up to them. Devyatayev adjusted what he could, reducing power, fighting the yaw as the aircraft pulled left. The Heinkel groaned, wounded, but still moving. Below them, the landscape changed. Burned villages, cratered roads, the scars of recent fighting. They were nearing the front line. Soviet territory was finally close enough to touch. Then the ground opened fire. Red tracer rounds climbed toward them. Soviet anti-aircraft gunners saw only one thing: a German bomber flying straight at their positions. The left engine burst into flames. Oil sprayed across the wing. The engine died completely. The bomber lurched and began to drop fast. One engine could not hold it. Altitude fell from 1,000 meters to 600. Men shouted. The aircraft shook violently. Devyatayev had seconds to decide. There would be no airfield, no second chance. He aimed for a snow-covered field and pulled back on the controls. The bomber hit the ground like a hammer. The landing gear collapsed instantly. Metal screamed. The aircraft tore itself apart across frozen earth before sliding to a stop. When the movement ended, there was only steam fire and silence. Devyatayev looked back into the wreckage. One by one, the men moved, bleeding, shaken, alive. Against all logic, all 10 of them had survived the fall. They crawled out of the wreckage and collapsed into the snow, dragging themselves away as fuel dripped onto hot metal. Behind them, the bomber burned. Ahead of them, Soviet soldiers sprinted from their trenches, with rifles raised, shouting commands. To the men in striped uniforms, this should have been the end of fear. It was not. Devyatayev stood up, swaying on his feet. He was covered in blood oil and ash. He raised his hands and shouted in Russian, "Do not shoot. We are Soviet. We escaped from Peenemünde. We stole this aircraft." The words sounded unreal even as he said them. The soldiers slowed, confused weapons still aimed. No one knew what to believe. Within hours, they were no longer treated as survivors, but as suspects. Soviet counterintelligence took control. The questions began immediately and did not stop. How did you survive when millions died? How did you learn to fly a German bomber? Who helped you? Who trained you? Each answer only led to another accusation. They were separated and interrogated for weeks. Devyatayev gave them everything: layouts of the base, rocket facilities, launch sites, information that would later shape the Soviet missile program. But gratitude never came. He was sent to a penal military unit, his rank gone, his record stained. The war ended 3 months later. Freedom had arrived, recognition had not. For 12 years, his story was buried, classified, ignored. While the nation moved forward, the man who stole a bomber to save 9 lives disappeared into silence, learning that surviving the enemy was only half the battle. For 12 years, Mikhail Devyatayev lived as a forgotten man. He returned home without his rank, without his wings, without recognition. The Soviet doctrine was unforgiving. Real heroes died. Anyone who survived captivity was suspect. While his intelligence from Peenemünde quietly helped advance missile research and shape the early Soviet space program, his name was never spoken. Then in 1957, the truth forced its way to the surface. Chief rocket designer Sergei Korolev intervened. He told officials what Devyatayev had done, how his escape had delivered priceless information, how this starving prisoner had risked everything to bring the future home with him. On August 15, 1957, 12 years after stealing a bomber while weighing just 38 kilograms, Mikhail Devyatayev was finally awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The highest honor, long overdue, quietly delivered. He had flown through flak, survived betrayal, and saved 9 lives. Yet the hardest part was not escaping Nazi Germany. It was surviving what came after. Because sometimes, history does not punish failure. It punishes those who live long enough to remember the truth. History often remembers machines, the rockets, the bombers, the steel, and the fire. But this story was never about a Heinkel or a runway in Peenemünde. It was about a starving man who refused to accept the ending written for him. A man who proved that even when the body is broken, the will can still take flight. Mikhail Devyatayev did not escape because conditions were favorable. He escaped because he understood something war tries to erase. That courage is not loud. It does not always come with orders or medals. Sometimes it weighs 38 kilograms, shakes with hunger, and climbs into a cockpit it was never meant to touch. 9 other men lived because one man remembered how to look at the sky, because he studied instead of surrendering, because he chose action over waiting. Their survival was not an accident. It was a decision made minute by minute, under fire against every rule of probability. This is why the story matters. October 1943. In the skies over Germany, B-17 crews weren't flying missions. They were flying into a slaughterhouse. Tail gunners were blind bombers were falling, and America's daylight bombing campaign was collapsing fast. Then a 22-year-old gunner broke the rules, built a forbidden invention from scrap, and turned the deadliest seat in the sky into a weapon the Luftwaffe feared. October 14, 1943. 25,000 feet above Germany, the tail section of a B-17 feels less like a fighting position and more like a steel coffin. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano is crouched behind 2.50 caliber machine guns. His knees locked, his gloves stiff with cold, his eyes fixed on the tiny plexiglass window in front of him. Then he sees it, a Focke-Wulf 190, sliding into position at 6 o'clock, low, the deadliest angle a bomber crew can face. Romano swings the gun's lines up the primitive ring and bead sight and fires. The tracers streak out and miss. Again, behind the fighter. Always behind. Seconds later, German 20mm cannons flash and another flying fortress is ripped apart in midair. That scene isn't rare. It's happening everywhere. On that single day, the U.S. 8th Air Force sends 291 B-17 deep into Germany without escort. By nightfall, 60 bombers are gone. Hundreds of Americans are dead. And the terrifying truth is impossible to ignore. The flying fortress can't protect itself. The tail gunner, supposed to be the bomber's last line of defense, is nearly blind firing with outdated sights against fighters closing at over 500 miles per hour. Hit rates are so low, survival becomes a math problem no crew can beat. And standing in that frozen tail section, Michael Romano begins to realize something chilling. The guns are not the problem. The sight is. That realization hits harder than flak. Because if the sight is the problem, then every bomber over Germany is fighting with a fatal handicap. The B-17 was sold as a flying fortress, a battleship in the sky, bristling with machine guns. On paper, it looked unstoppable. In combat, it was something else entirely, especially for the tail gunner. Wedged into a compartment barely bigger than a coffin, Romano had to balance on a narrow bicycle seat, wrestle 2 84-pound Brownings through freezing air, and somehow hit a fighter tearing toward him at insane closing speeds. There was no computer, no lead indicator, no miracle device to tell him where to aim. Just a crude ring and bead sight, 2 pieces of metal, and a prayer. To score a hit, he had to do the impossible, need seconds, judge speed, distance angle, bullet drop, and deflection, all while oxygen-starved, half-frozen, and under fire. Even expert gunners in training barely managed decent scores. In real combat, hit rates collapsed to almost nothing. The Luftwaffe knew it. German pilots came in from 6 o'clock low again and again, absorbing a few seconds of wild return fire, before unleashing 20-millimeter cannon shells that shredded aluminum fuel lines and flesh. Romano saw the pattern mission after mission. He fired hundreds of rounds. He watched tracers stream harmlessly behind enemy fighters. He watched bombers in his formation blow apart anyway. Then his best friend, the tail gunner, in a neighboring B-17, was killed in exactly the kind of rear attack Romano had failed to stop. That was the breaking point. Late that night, long after the rest of the base had gone dark, Romano climbed back into the reeking tail section with a flashlight and his logbook. Cordite still hung in the air. Hydraulic fluid streaked the metal. He stared at the useless sight in front of him and understood something the engineers had missed. The guns weren't failing because they were weak. The guns were failing because the man firing them couldn't truly see where his bullets were going. And in that cold, cramped tail, Michael Romano began sketching an idea that had no right to work, and every reason to change everything. What Romano saw that night wasn't some grand engineering revelation. It was a reflection. In the curved plexiglass of the tail window, he caught a warped glimpse of angles his iron sight could never cover. And suddenly the answer snapped into focus. What if he could stop guessing? What if he could see his own tracer path in real time, correct his aim instantly, and track a fighter without losing it in that narrow, frozen tunnel of glass and steel? He started sketching like a man racing death itself. Not a factory redesign, not a miracle weapon, just a brutal, practical fix, small mirrors mounted at precise angles, paired with a reflector sight ripped from another aircraft. A jury-rigged system that would let a tail gunner watch both the target and the path of his bullets at the same time. No computing gun sight, no official blueprint, just scrap metal glass and instinct. There was only one problem: it was illegal. Army Air Force's regulations explicitly banned unauthorized modifications to combat armament. Install something like this without approval, and Romano could face court-martial. But by now, the rules looked a lot less important than the funerals. So Romano went looking for someone crazy enough to help him. He found him in the sheet metal shop, Technical Sergeant Frank Kellerman, an older mechanic with Depression-era scavenger skills and the kind of practical intelligence no manual could teach. Kellerman studied the sketches, understood the risk instantly, and asked only one question: when do you fly again? The answer was, tomorrow. That night, while the rest of the base slept, the two men built Romano's forbidden invention out of wreckage mirrors from damaged equipment, plexiglass from shattered canopies, brackets cut from scrap aluminum, and a reflector sight salvaged from a ruined P-47. By dawn, the tail of Romano's B-17 held something no engineer had approved, and no German pilot was expecting. By dawn, Romano's B-17 wasn't just carrying bombs, it was carrying a secret. No entry in the maintenance log, no approval from engineering, no blessing from the brass. Just a welded bracket, a scavenged reflector sight, 3 carefully angled mirrors, and one tail gunner betting his life on something built in the dark. Hours later, over Germany, the test came fast. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 slid into the classic kill position, 6 o'clock, low closing, hard. The exact attack that had been murdering B-17 crews for months. Romano locked onto it through the new reflector sight. For the first time, the target didn't feel like a blur outrunning his instincts. The glowing reticle held steady. In the edge of his vision, The mirrors showed him what he had never truly seen before, where his guns were actually pointing. He fired. The first burst trailed behind the fighter. Under the old system, that would have been the end of it. Another miss. Another German pilot coming in untouched. But now, Romano saw the error instantly. He shifted his lead by a fraction, and fired again. This time the tracers walked straight into the engine. The BF-109 exploded in black smoke, rolled inverted, and fell out of the sky. For a second, Romano just stared. Not at the fighter, at the mirrors. It worked. But the celebration didn't last. Back on the ground during post-flight inspection, the unauthorized hardware was discovered. Within minutes, angry officers were at the aircraft regulations in hand, ready to tear the whole thing out. To them, Romano hadn't just improvised, he had crossed the line. And now the man who may have just saved the bomber force was about to be punished for it. What happened next could have ended in a court-martial. Instead, it became a test the entire bomber force desperately needed. The officers were furious. To them, Romano's invention wasn't a breakthrough, it was a violation. Unauthorized parts, unapproved modifications, salvaged components bolted into a combat aircraft without a single signature. Captain Richard Voss didn't care that Romano had just scored his first kill. In his eyes, discipline mattered more than improvisation. He ordered the system removed immediately. But combat had a way of making regulations look small. Word spread through the 91st Bomb Group before the sun even went down. Tail gunners wanted to see the mirrors for themselves. Operations officers wanted the gun camera footage. And senior commanders, drowning in casualty reports, wanted one answer: did it work or was it luck? That question reached Colonel Stanley Ray. Ray listened as engineers warned about safety procedure and precedent. Then he listened to the numbers: 17 bombers lost in a single week, hundreds of airmen gone, and almost nothing to show for it in enemy fighters destroyed. The silence in that room said more than the shouting ever could. The current system was failing. Everyone knew it. Romano had simply been reckless enough to prove there might be another way. So Ray made his decision. The mirrors would stay. Romano would fly the next 3 missions with gun cameras, recording every burst, every correction, every engagement. If the sight failed, it would be ripped out and Romano would pay the price. But if it worked, the Army Air Forces might be looking at the first real answer to the tail gunner's nightmare. It was a gamble made under the shadow of death, because now Romano wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was flying to prove that a fix built from scrap metal in the dark could succeed where the official system had already failed. Romano climbed into the tail for those next missions, knowing exactly what was at stake. One failure and the mirrors would be ripped out. One bad burst and the brass would call the whole thing a desperate stunt. But over the North Sea and deep into enemy airspace, theory gave way to something far more convincing results. When the fighters came in again, Romano didn't fire like a blind man, gambling on instinct. He fired like a gunner who could finally see. Through the reflector sight, the enemy stayed centered. In the edge of his vision, the mirrors revealed the truth no iron sight ever could. The exact relationship between his barrels, his tracers, and the target. Misses were no longer mysteries. They were corrections waiting to happen. The change was immediate. A Focke-Wulf dived in. Romano tracked, fired, adjusted, and watched the fighter break away, smoking. Minutes later, A Messerschmitt tried the same rear attack profile that had slaughtered bomber crews for months. This time, the old script collapsed. Romano's burst tore into the canopy and engine, sending the fighter rolling out of control. Gun cameras captured everything, every movement, every correction, every hit. Back at base, the footage shut people up fast. Romano had returned with confirmed kills, fewer rounds spent, and something far more important than personal glory proof. The impossible little contraption built from scrap and nerve had turned a tail gunner from a desperate defender into a real threat. Even the skeptics in engineering could no longer hide behind paperwork. The mirrors worked, the sight worked, and the math was changing. That's when the story stopped being about one gunner. Because once commanders saw what the camera saw, Romano's illegal fix became a battlefield necessity. In the maintenance hangars, crews began scavenging damaged aircraft for parts. Reflector sights were stripped from wrecked fighters. Brackets were cut, shaped, and bolted together by hand. What had started as one man's act of defiance was becoming something much bigger. A quiet revolution was spreading across the 91st Bomb Group, and with every new installation, the Luftwaffe was about to learn a brutal lesson. The easy kill at 6 o'clock was over. The transformation was fast enough to feel almost unreal. In the span of days, Romano's homemade sight system spread from one B-17 to another, not through official channels, but through urgency, desperation, and the cold logic of survival. Crews who had once climbed into the tail knowing they were the weakest link now had something they had never truly possessed before: confidence. Not false bravado, not propaganda. Real confidence built on tracers that finally landed where they were supposed to. And the difference showed almost immediately in combat. When German fighters came in from the rear, they were no longer charging into a blind spray of .50 caliber fire. They were flying into aimed, corrected, relentless bursts. Tail gunners who had spent months missing now started scoring hits. Fighters broke off early. Some never broke off at all. Mission after mission, the numbers began to turn. Confirmed kills climbed. Rear quarter attacks became bloodier for the Luftwaffe. The deadliest angle in the sky was no longer safe. That shift did more than save airplanes. It changed behavior. German pilots noticed. Their combat reports began warning that American tail guns were suddenly far more accurate. What had once been a routine 6 o'clock attack was becoming a gamble with terrible odds. A bomber formation that had looked vulnerable now had teeth. And in aerial warfare, perception could be as deadly as firepower. The moment enemy pilots started hesitating, the balance changed. Back in England, the brass could no longer dismiss Romano's invention as a reckless stunt. Too many gun camera reels, too many damaged fighters, too many crews returning home because a kid from Pittsburgh refused to accept a broken system. Senior commanders arrived, inspected the setup, studied the results, and came to the only conclusion left: this thing had to spread. Soon Romano's battlefield fix was on its way to becoming official doctrine. And with that, the story stopped being about one illegal modification in one bomber's tail. It became a blunt, embarrassing truth for the Army Air Forces, while engineers argued a 22-year-old enlisted gunner had already solved the problem. And once that truth was exposed, the chain reaction was unstoppable. What began as Romano's secret fix in the tail of a single B-17 now moved beyond rumor, beyond argument, and beyond the reach of officers who wanted it buried in paperwork. Commanders at higher levels came to see it for themselves. They climbed into the cramped tail section, studied the mirrors, watched the gun camera reels, and saw the same brutal conclusion over and over again. The illegal site was doing what the official system had failed to do, keeping American crews alive. So the order came down. Build more. In the maintenance hangars at Bassingbourn, scavenging turned into production. Damaged fighters were stripped for reflector sights. Scrap aluminum became brackets. Mechanics worked like black market engineers in uniform assembling Romano's mirror systems by hand and installing them as fast as humanly possible. There was nothing elegant about it. No polished factory finish, no ceremonial approval, just urgency tools and the understanding that every hour wasted meant more bombers burning over Germany. Then came the real proof, the numbers. As more B-17S received the new sighting system tailgun, accuracy surged. Rear attacks that had once been almost routine for the Luftwaffe suddenly became costly. German pilots started paying for 6 o'clock runs with burning engines, shattered canopies, and smoking dives to earth. The bomber crews could feel the difference immediately. Men who had once entered combat expecting helplessness now fought back with precision, and the impact reached far beyond one bomb group. By late 1943, Romano's field modification was spreading across the 8th Air Force, influencing official redesigns and feeding directly into improved tail turret development. The principle was simple but devastatingly effective. Let the gunner see the fight clearly, and he can change it. That was the moment Michael Romano stopped being just another tail gunner trying to survive. He became the enlisted man whose forbidden invention forced the Luftwaffe to rethink the sky itself. And that was the real shockwave. Romano's fix didn't stay in one tail section, one bomb group, or even one chapter of the war. It spread. By December 1943, the mirror reflector system was showing up across more and more B-17 instances, and what had started as a rule-breaking act of desperation was becoming something far more dangerous to the Luftwaffe, a pattern. Rear attacks that once looked almost effortless were now turning into death traps. German pilots who had spent months sliding into 6 o'clock low with confidence suddenly found themselves flying into corrected, concentrated .50 caliber fire. The sky hadn't changed. The gunner had. And with that change, the numbers began to move in America's favor. Bomber groups using improved tail sights saw losses from rear attacks drop sharply. Crews who statistically should have died made it home instead. Damaged fortresses limped back across the channel rather than vanishing in smoke over Germany. In the brutal arithmetic of air war, that meant something enormous. More aircraft saved more crews, surviving more missions completed, and a daylight bombing campaign that no longer looked doomed to collapse under its own casualties. Even Boeing took notice. The company's improved Cheyenne tail turret, developed for later B-17s, absorbed the same core principle Romano had stumbled onto in the dark: give the gunner a clearer picture and you give him a fighting chance. What had been mocked as illegal, crude, and dangerous was now shaping official design. Romano himself kept flying. He kept fighting. He kept surviving. But by then the story was already bigger than one man's kill count. Because this was never just about shooting down fighters. It was about changing the fate of thousands of men packed inside aluminum bombers over enemy territory. It was about proving that while generals debated and engineers delayed, a 22-year-old tail gunner with scrap metal and nerve had found the answer first. And in war, the men who change the odds don't always wear stars on their collars. Sometimes they're the ones freezing in the tail, refusing to miss again. But the final chapter of this story isn't really about hardware. It's about defiance. Romano kept flying until the war caught up with him. In February 1944, during the massive air offensive, later known as Big Week, his bomber was torn open by flak over Germany. Fuel sprayed through the tail. Hydraulic fluid coated the metal around him. Fighters were still hunting. And even then, Romano kept firing. When the crippled aircraft finally came down, he survived the crash, only to spend the last months of the war as a prisoner in Germany. He came home in 1945, thinner, quieter, and decorated. The Army Air Forces gave him the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation praised his service, his courage, his contribution to bomber defense. But it left out the most unbelievable part, that the system helping save American crews across Europe had started as an illegal midnight modification built from scrap. And maybe that was fitting, because Michael Romano never acted like a hero in a headline. He didn't chase fame. He didn't tour factories. He didn't build a legend around himself. He went back to Pittsburgh, married, raised a family, worked as a machinist, and rarely talked about the war. While official histories focused on generals' doctrines and production lines, the truth sat quietly in the background. Thousands of men came home because one tail gunner refused to accept a broken system. That is Romano's legacy. Not just the mirrors, not just the sight, not just the fighters shot down. It was the courage to look at a deadly failure, ignore the rank above him, and fix it anyway. Because sometimes the men who change history are not the ones given permission. They're the ones who know that if they wait for permission, more people die. And that is why Michael Romano's story hits harder than most war legends, because it was never supposed to happen. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a Boeing engineer. He wasn't a celebrated ace with a row of medals and a polished biography. He was a 22-year-old enlisted tail gunner from Pittsburgh, jammed into the coldest, most exposed corner of a B-17, watching good men die because the system meant to protect them simply did not work. While officers argued over procedure and engineers chased timelines, Romano made a choice that could have destroyed his career and possibly saved his life. At the same time, he stopped waiting. That choice changed everything. His crude mirror and reflector sight began as an act of desperation. But in the skies over Europe, desperation became innovation, and innovation became survival. Bomber crews who once faced rear attacks like a death sentence suddenly had a fighting chance. German pilots who had hunted flying fortresses from 6 o'clock with near impunity now met accurate, corrected fire. And the deadliest seat in the bomber force, the tail became a place where the sky could finally fight back. That is the real legacy Romano left behind. Not just improved hit rates, not just fewer bombers lost, not just thousands of airmen who made it home when statistics said they shouldn't. His legacy was bigger than numbers. He proved that sometimes the most important breakthrough in war does not come from a conference room, a procurement board, or a factory floor. Sometimes it comes from one man under pressure looking at a deadly problem and refusing to accept it as normal. Because history remembers victories, but survival often belongs to the people who break the rules before the rules can bury everyone else. And maybe that is the most unsettling part of all. Michael Romano did not save lives because the system worked. He saved lives because the system failed and he refused to fail with it. In a war driven by giant factories, polished doctrines, and layers of command, the breakthrough that mattered came from a freezing tail compartment from a kid with no engineering degree, no authority, and no permission. Just urgency, just instinct, just the unbearable sight of bombers falling out of the sky while everyone else debated paperwork. That is what makes his story feel bigger than one invention. Romano exposed the truth. Armies hate to admit, sometimes the men closest to death understand the problem long before the men farthest from it. The officers saw regulations. The engineers saw procedure. Romano saw friends dying behind useless iron sights. And when survival becomes that brutally simple hesitation, starts to look a lot like surrender. His mirrors did more than improve accuracy. They changed morale. They changed tactics. They changed who came home.